Hello everyone and welcome back to another history lecture. I apologize for the somewhat longer time frames in between my video production now. I feel like they've always been like a mode of passion project for me, so before I had subscribers I would never actually think about how long it would take to make a video because it would be leisurely, but recently I do feel a bit more pressure to have more concrete readings, thus read a lot more books and be able to educate myself on a lot more topics. And if you've noticed, my videos have been a little bit longer in length because I have been taking a lot more time and thinking and producing my talking points, and which has been a little bit difficult because I really want to make sure it never feels forced or that it's take the enjoyment out of this for me. Usually I complete these videos on breaks when I have respites in between school and work, but this past spring break I was able to save up enough money to spend it in Paris with my very dear friends. And even then, I think I was thinking and constantly occupied with this mindset of needing to be productive with that time to produce or to create something for this channel. So I actually tried making this video on Textiles, which translates very roughly to spot in French, and it was like kind of the originator for abstract expressionist like splatter Jackson Pollock paint in France. It actually didn't really end up working out at all, which I'm kind of glad because I didn't really like the fact that I was approaching this channel with this mindset that I needed to be producing something, or I felt like I had to be forced to produce something, and like this neoliberal mindset of constantly needing to be capable of managing a time that's supposed to be restful and relaxing and enjoyable for me. Anyways, I did have a great time, and speaking of friends, recently I feel like there have been a lot of birthdays and anniversaries in my life, which has thus meant a lot of gift idea. And all the previous gift ideas I have been kind of coming up with recently have been very sewing and craft based because unfortunately that Paris trip completely burned a hole in my financial capabilities right now. And I've definitely always taken an interest in sewing because I always try to hand sew in my little college apartment, but it's pretty hard to create like very large scale projects or more like time consuming things without a sewing machine. I can't really do much beyond reattaching buttons, but even then I think the small projects like fixing little holes or rips in my friends' clothes for them, or patching like little charms together as gifts still is something that makes it very special and intentional to me. And I feel like this act of sewing, like this act of actually inserting your own labor into being able to give someone, actually really holds this certain kind of intimacy to be able to give to them. And I've discussed this quite often in a lot of my previous videos. I feel like I've done a couple to a few videos on textile art, and this, I think, sewing and this ability to insert your own labor within, like I've discussed this act of sewing, this act of textile, like tactical work is everywhere and it does exist in every culture. And in a previous video that is still very special to me that I really still like, I explored bojagi, which was the Korean art of wrapping cloth like around gifts to be able to give. And I thought I'd kind of leave it there, like somewhere between this idea of explaining tradition and textile and art. But the more I kept thinking about how fabric is able to hold this incredible presence in feminine history, I think the more I realized it really revealed itself about this concept of labor, about gender, and about how it implicates itself within capitalism. And that topic itself is so broad and can be explained in so many different ways, and absolutely no video essay, at least in my own capabilities, would ever be able to fully express it in its totality. But I was thinking about it, and I think that I did want to make a video about it that extends beyond itself as a mere historically niche practice or craft, and a little bit more about how it holds so much more political and cultural sentiment with like more modern and contemporary artists. But before I fully delved into it, I did want to show everyone the tea I'm drinking today, which is the sticky rice oolong that I got from a tea shop in Paris. But it is just a normal green oolong and I do recommend it. A bigger thing I've been trying to do recently when I do my personal research on art history and specifically specific artist practice is I have tried to veer away from very traditional art history critique books or critiques of the art practice from an art historian or someone who considers themselves a critic, because I've noticed that when you read their thoughts, I'm not saying they're invalid in any way, but you kind of adopt their way of thinking. You kind of inevitably absorb and implement their perspective into your own. So recently I've been trying to read a lot more specifically interviews with the artists or the artists themselves about what they think about their craft and what they actually directly have to say about their work, because I think that feels a little bit more authentic and I can actually formulate my own process of thinking directly from what they see themselves as in relation to what they practice. But one of the artists I will be talking about today is Kimsooja, in Korean Kimsooja. And I finished this anthology of interviews edited by Meyer Stroll by her, and I actually found this in the art history library provided by my school, and you're not allowed to take books out of there, so I'm actually not allowed to have this in my apartment right now, but I'm going to give it back. But this book is essentially just like a collection of all the interviews she's done with publications and other artists and anything she's ever really publicly said in discourse about her own work. And with this book, through reading her interviews, you really get to understand that she's not just known for using fabric as a medium, but as like a philosophy in itself. And a lot of her work involves wrapping bundles of used clothes and traditional Korean bed covers into what she calls this term bottari. And I think it's really interesting because her work really exists between this categorization of sculpture and painting and performance all in itself. And to go back to my previous video on bojagi, which if you don't know and you didn't watch it, it's the Korean traditional practice of putting together all your unused scraps from past sewing projects and sewing it into a singular piece of cloth, which can be used to cover leftover food or wrap gifts or, just as decoration. And a lot of people mistake Kimsooja's bottari work as an extension or a contemporary understanding of bojagi, but in her interview, she made it very adamant that it was not bojagi. It's not using pieces or scraps of leftover projects. She is basically using the full form of already worn clothes and specifically bed covers to wrap and bind these fabrics into sculptural units of memory, which is very interesting because in modern Korean culture, I've noticed that there is a much higher opposition or taboo against buying secondhand clothing and wearing it, or just using anything secondhand or vintage in general, even though I feel like that's something very popular and admired in American culture. Kimsooja's name in itself is this singular combination of her Korean last name and her first name as a one-word name that totally refuses any form of gender identity or marital status or socio-political or cultural geographical identity by not separating her family name from her first name. What I do really want to pinpoint and what I really admire is that she doesn't frame sewing as, or she recognizes that it is, but she doesn't frame her work specifically as a feminine craft, but rather more of an existential practice. A lot of the things that she uses, a lot of her projects used her deceased grandmother's used clothing, and she didn't use it just to be nostalgic, but she used it to reflect on this idea of life and death and memory. And in Korea, people often keep a loved one's clothes after they pass. To give it away or to throw it away is considered very incredibly disrespectful. And also the bed covers, like I mentioned specifically before she used, were always embroidered with very traditional, beautiful Confucian symbols of peacocks, phoenixes, and butterflies. And it's really interesting in Korean culture, at least traditionally. I myself am mere Korean American, so I am not actually as directly immersed in the culture itself if I lived there, but traditionally when a couple is newlywed, you are expected to gift them bed covers, and these bed covers are kind of embroidered with these very traditional Confucian symbols of peacocks and phoenixes and butterflies, and these kind of contain very strong subliminal metaphors for expectations of marriage and children and happiness. But when Kimsooja would find them, in secondhand stores or discarded, or the fact that they had been given away, she sees them as tossed aside and abandoned, and in itself a metaphor for an empty skin. In this book, she talks a lot about how she started sewing as her main medium and her main craft, not necessarily because she was really skilled or good at it, but rather she saw this act of sewing in relation to her daily life of walking and breathing and mirroring. And she says the reason she uses these bed covers is, quote, "Bed covers are the frames for our body and our lives, and a fundamental site of humanity where we are born, love, dream, rest, suffer, and finally die." Western understandings of art and Western art critics and magazines have always asked her if she considers herself a found object artist, because she is not technically necessarily creating the bed covers to put into her work, but rather finding meaning in these creations made by other creators themselves. One magazine actually asked her if she considers her work in relation to the Duchampian method of ready-made at all, and she replied that she actually completely departs and diverges from the ready-made, and despite she is working with surfaces or objects made by others, I think that she thinks she completely enters a new genre in what can be understood as the existential minimalism, like this reverse of the ready-made, which was made to technically critique mass production, but rather carries this idea of humanity, that real people can still make real products because of a particular personal context and an idea which has been so fatally lost in this current context of capitalistic speed and a constant need to keep moving and keep purchasing. Her interest really lies in this idea of the pre-used rather than the pre-made. One very, very interesting piece she did was in 1997. She embarked on an 11-day performance art piece, part of Cities on the Move series, called 2,727 kilometers bottari truck. And during this journey, she traveled across South Korea. She was revisiting cities and urban areas that she had already previously lived in, but with a truck loaded with bottari, a bunch of her sculptures in the back, and videotaping herself sitting on top of these very colorful bundles. And she uses these bundles, these misshapen objects wrapped in bed covers that she considers bodies and skin, as kind of like this metaphor of embodying this concept of mobility and existentialism when it comes to regarding one's own life. And beyond personal reflection, the truck actually delves a lot into the current political and social issues that were going on at the time. Like, she actually dedicated this performance for the experience of refugees and displaced populations. Like, she actually dedicated this piece to Kosovan refugees and speaking to the current humanitarian crisis at the time of the late 1990s of the mass displacement of ethnic Albanians from Kosovo due to the Kosovan War and NATO's very controversial political decisions and intervention. Her process is about like a grandiose message for feminism or like anything greater beyond that, or like any grand intervention, but very small accumulations of intimacy and repetition and memory. And I think this idea of like very quietly embedded labor starts to feel especially relevant when you actually zoom it even out of the Korean contemporary context and look at the world and how crucial this idea of textile production and sewing is. And I also recently finished reading this book. It's called Experimental Times, Startup Capitalism, and Feminist Futures in India. And in this, the author Gupta actually mainly focuses on the city of Bengeluru, which historically is a city very dominantly based and reliant on textile production, where generations of women actually worked in garment factories and weaving and sewing. But now how this form of very traditional labor has kind of been pushed aside and starting to be outsourced and made invisible by something a lot more shinier and faster and more palatable to a global economy, which is startup capitalism. can be said about this. She really just focused, and I think although so much can be said about this, like especially in the context of like transporting this idea of a very Western economic trend into a developing country, but she specifically talks about how this transition is very gendered and classed, and how this idea of the new public woman in Bengeluru society is like the mid-century American counterpart, in which the working woman is no longer a textile worker but a consumer. And this idea of this newfound ability to move because she is a consumer through cities, through markets, digital platforms, and how this idea of consumption becomes like this currency of liberation. She specifically works at this specific like startup agency where she interviews and befriends a lot of Indian women experiencing this and kind of accounts it into her theory. She focuses in on this travel boutique agency called Captivate, and the idea that the women working in the startup agency were able to liberate themselves from traditional caste society and expectations of marriage and the traditional domestic role of a woman, because they were now able to earn a wage and liberate herself as this consumer and perform these public acts of consumption that are the sole defining feature of her individuality. And coincidentally, I think you can see this really reflected in American history, specifically like after World War II, women who entered the workforce were pushed back into their domestic roles after all the men returned home. But the idea of like the middle class housewife becoming like the main targeted consumer demographic became incredibly popular, and women's liberation kind of began becoming tied to purchasing power with home appliances and beauty products and like leisurely forms of activity. And from here, I think I really see it as like this origin point of how feminism has been able to become marketized and aestheticized and commodified. And this is kind of also how she describes this idea of the startup entrepreneur in Bangalore as this fetishized figure, as this idea, not just women, but also men being able to transform oneself into change this very special exalted status of becoming an entrepreneur, of this self-made, liberated, like positive, very extroverted figure who can network and has mastered this art of persuasion that has liberated themselves. And as we've been discussing, a huge part of the assumed female domestic social role is her ability to produce children. And recently, there definitely has been a bit more debate in the realm of whether reproducing and bringing more children into this world represents realm of social continuity versus social disruption. And I mean, right now we're looking at like the inevitable consequences of this dilemma, like with countries like South Korea and Japan kind of experiencing the very negative real-time consequences of a hyper-capitalist environment that has dissuaded a majority of women from able to think that the world is healthy and a safe environment enough for them to bring and use their bodily effort to raise a child in this society. And I kind of wanted to connect this to a larger theme that I discussed in my most recent video, which was deconstructing the role of like the elite singular artists within this practice of socially engaged art. And this comes with the idea of engaging the collective, this idea that everyone is able to produce and partake in a work of art without deconstructing it or dissuading it down to a singular all-powerful name. And interestingly, one thing I didn't touch on is a lot of artists who base their work in this practice tend to look towards children to fulfill that role. And typically, if you think about it, children are regarded as our future. They are regarded as like this next generation capable of being formed and malleable, and if you think about it, typically children are regarded as our future. They are regarded as like this next generation capable of being able to be malleable and formed and educated to lead us towards a more positivic future than in the current like dire social crisis we live in right now. The child in the neoliberal framework is conceived as like this bearer of future investment. this outcome of female physicality as a mere potential benefit to society, despite absolutely no financial support or neoliberally defined wage given to women to even endure the material physicality of being pregnant, or no wage for raising this child care, even though we define and put such a big label on being able to invest in our children for the benefit of a more optimistic outlook. A lot of this, I kind of want to drive back, is reflected in a lot of art programs as well. Like when we're looking at children's workshops in museums, like interactive exhibits that are geared towards the younger mind. Like if you go to an arts museum, a majority of like the hands-on exhibits or experiences are geared for the very, very younger children, to encourage these very younger minds to want to engage with these institutions. And another really interesting book I recently read, Wages Against Artwork. And in this other really interesting book I read, Wages Against Artwork, this author, Claire Laberge, goes very deep into this overall idea of decommodified labor. And she has so many different chapters of what this actually means when it comes to producing art. But there's this one chapter that's really interesting where she focuses specifically on implicating a child within the social practice of art. And in the sense that just because they are not able or legally allowed to earn a financial wage for whatever labor they are participating in, when participating in art, it becomes decommodified in the fact that they are participating within it. And there's this very, very interesting artwork that she discusses, which is by Berrigan in 2012, called Lesson in Capitalism. And it's like this thing, it was like this performance art piece held within a museum. Essentially what happened was visitors would enter a gallery and be met with a very, very like professional looking figure dressed in a suit who was labeled as the business consultant. And what he would do is he would direct visitors or willing visitors into this room where a group of anonymous, quote, financial advisors were on site but hidden. And the visitors were urged to ask questions about one's own personal finances, like managing a Roth IRA, or advice on bond yields, or, managing student debt. And to emphasize, you couldn't see these, quote, financial advisors, you couldn't see who they were, but they were just there behind the wall, I think. It's funny because in the synopsis, Berrigan wrote, quote, he teamed up with the Carpenter Center and Harvard Business School affiliates to operate a free financial advice booth during scheduled participatory performances. And little to the guests and visitors' information, the advisors were actually children aged 5 to 10. And what they would do is they would answer the visitor's question by using magic markers to create free-form drawings. Because they cannot work legally as wage laborers as children, Laberge uses this idea of children being able to be capable of making art without working as artists, because this is like a very genuine, rare instance in which producing art is purely and fully decommodified. And it's so interesting to think that it's come to this point in art, that it's only in the instances that children or animals are producing art that it's fully decommodified. Because during the Industrial Revolution, if you think about it, child labor was justified in the sense that smaller hands, like little hands and physicality, were considered the most ideal for weaving. And weaving and the act of production of textiles isn't just a gendered metaphor. It's the fact that the industry in totality itself is so crucial to the foundations of capitalism, of what composes like this literal backbone of the Industrial Revolution, which makes it even more like a literal, significantly material act of production. Kind of going in a circle, another really interesting Korean contemporary artist I wanted to bring up is Kyongah Ham, who is a contemporary artist who was born in 1966, who creates this very massive, large-scale embroidered renderings of very luminous, glittering chandeliers. And some of these pieces are literally like 12 feet to 9 feet high, and from a distance they look like almost so realistic, they almost look like photographs set against like massive black like backdrops. But if you as the viewer actually go up closer to the colorful chandelier, you can notice that it's actually composed of silk thread, and she notes that she chose the idea of visual chandeliers as the main point of her project. She uses this motif of specifically fallen chandeliers as her main visual focus because she talks about how she wants it to represent the foreign powers that were the causation of the division of Korea. And essentially these manifestations of silk thread of chandelier are her expressing her frustrations about the still ongoing political conflict of a border that was imposed on her peninsula by non-Koreans through a Western ideological proxy war. And although the works are technically titled with Ham's name, these panels are not just her work, and rather they've actually been sewn by numerous women and unseen craftspeople in North Korea. These works are actually created in incredibly risky dialogue with anonymous North Korean artisans who convert Ham's coded instructions that are sent across the border into these finished compositions that takes like up to several years. And many of her early works were inevitably confiscated by North Korean authorities either on the way or in or out of the country. Her instructions to be able to weave something and send it back to her is, obviously kept under wraps. She was actually asked in an interview if she wished that she could see the reactions of the embroiderers in person, and she replied, quote, "Sometimes I see evidence in the work that reveals subtle reactions to our collaboration, and I feel like I have communicated with them." So after all this, I keep wanting, and I want to return to the fact that the simple act of sewing is seeing it beyond an act, but as part of a larger system that has quietly and historically held up like literal entire economies. However, despite my pressing theme of gender and like this very like feminine imposed role in this video, I would like to emphasize that neither Kimsooja or Kyongah Ham call themselves feminist artists, and when asked in interviews, they always are very in opposition to being considered this label or taking on this very heavy term. Not because their work doesn't address gender, because it inevitably does, but because labeling themselves in that kind of way implies that their personal identity is invested into their work, when the role of the modern conceptual artist is to dematerialize one's identity completely from the work. And so, kind of like to bring it back to a personal reflection, when I am hand sewing in my college apartment, and I think a lot about the things we do with our hands that are not necessarily considered, quote, work. Or I think about how these practices are still able to survive in these global economies and political conflicts and social expectations, and still somehow manage to hold on to something so human and so material. And like I mentioned in the beginning of this video, it would be very, very difficult to be able to encompass an entire global context into this subject of sewing and handwork and female labor in the global context, because like there would be so much, and I do realize I made it very personal and niche and specific to my own interest as a Korean American and using these Korean contemporary female artists. And although Ham's work was not derived from this book, another really interesting book that kind of discussed this was actually this. I actually also stole this from the art history library. I'm not allowed to have this, but it's exploring North Korean arts, and it's a series of essays exactly how this idea of art exists within the economic, it exists within the political, it exists within the cultural, like even in regimes where, the global perspective of it is oppressive. In this context of how can art exist within something so regimatic and diplomatic. It does exist in these systems, and I think this is a good read that really touches on it. So with that being said, I am so grateful if you made it to the end of the video, as I am with all of them. I hope you were able to take away from it, and I hope my end goal is always, I hope you were able to learn something from this. So with that being said, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye!